And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Welcome to the aviation section of Alaska Weather. I'm Eric Holloway with the National Weather Service. For September 15th, 2023, a couple of options for you. 1-800 number, get you into a menu-driven system. And out on the World Wide Web at weather.gov/Alaska. And lastly, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please email us. Taking a quick look at the satellite information this morning. This is a little bit early, but still you get the picture that we've got a system coming in there in the Bering Sea way out there. We also have a system coming into the Bering Sea, and this pattern will continue for the next couple of days with systems coming into the Bering, then shifting into the Gulf of Alaska. Some cloudiness along the Alaska Range and another low up there near Kotzebue, driving some cloudiness up in that region of the state. Also some weak onshore flow along the Arctic coast, driving some low clouds and low ceilings up there for aviation. So flying weather for Saturday morning, look at the IFR conditions up there on the Arctic coast. And again, IFR conditions up there near Kotzebue and marginal conditions along the west coast, but otherwise IFR conditions along the Alaska Range and marginal conditions in the Panhandle and IFR conditions out along the coastal areas of the Gulf. And again, that's associated with a low pressure system moving in there, and IFR conditions down through the Bering Sea and some marginal conditions there along the Alaska Peninsula, but otherwise around the rest of the state, basically VFR conditions. For Saturday afternoon, looking at portions of the mainland under VFR conditions, actually a large portion of the state under VFR conditions, but otherwise IFR conditions along the Arctic coast. IFR conditions in the Gulf of Alaska, IFR conditions way out there in the Bering Sea and Aleutians, and then some areas of marginal conditions down through the Alaska Range, Cook Inlet, and over in the Panhandle. Then for flying weather, Sunday morning, looking at VFR conditions over a good portion of the state, continued IFR conditions along the Arctic coast and North Slope, IFR conditions out there in the Bering Sea and Aleutians, marginal conditions across the rest of the Bering Sea, and marginal conditions in the Gulf of Alaska and into the Panhandle. For flying weather on Sunday afternoon, looking continued IFR conditions along the Arctic coast and North Slope, marginal conditions down through the Alaska Range and portions of the interior, and marginal conditions over there in the Panhandle. Some VFR conditions showing up there in the southwest and portions of the west, and IFR conditions in much of the Bering Sea. Increasing flying capabilities out there in the Aleutians with marginal conditions expected out there for Sunday afternoon. Forecast conditions on Saturday, looking at Anaktuvik, looking for VFR decreasing to marginal. Same for Adigan, Lake Clark and Merrill. We're going to keep them in IFR conditions all day on Saturday. Same for Rainy Pass. And then if you get up into Windy, VFR conditions up there. Isabel is the same thing. Mentasta, also pretty good flying conditions there. Tanita, VFR flying conditions expected. Marginal conditions down there in Portage, but still otherwise pretty good flying conditions in the Prince William Sound area. And then Chilkoot and White went for IFR conditions, improving to marginal conditions during the day on Saturday. For our freezing levels, Saturday morning, looking at a chaotic map, but generally 2,000 foot freezing level cuts across the main part of the state there and over into Canada, and then back across the southern coast and over into the Bering Sea. Elevated freezing levels, and you get into the northern portion of the Pacific, otherwise 6,000 feet bullseye there in the Gulf of Alaska. For icing conditions on Saturday, looking at basically a large area of considerable moderate icing conditions expected with that low pressure system in the Gulf of Alaska. And that extends up through south central Alaska and into portions of the Alaska Range, but otherwise isolated moderate in portions of the Panhandle and up through the interior and along the Brooks Range. And again, another spot there with considerable moderate icing. And again, this is above 8,000 feet and above 10,000 feet out there in the western Aleutians. For the jet stream, looking at that low pressure system driving some southerly winds into the Gulf of Alaska and then westerly as you get into the Panhandle, up to 70 knots there. Otherwise 40 knots or less across much of the mainland from the southerly direction, and then more northerly direction as you get through the Bering Sea, up to 135 knots there, cutting across the eastern Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula there, out there in the southern end of the Alaska Peninsula. Then for 9,000 foot winds on Saturday, again southerly winds coming into the Gulf of Alaska, into the Panhandle, up to 45 to even 60 knots there. Otherwise light and variable across much of the mainland and into the southwest and west. And then northerly flow down through the Bering Sea, cutting across the Alaska Peninsula up to 65, anywhere between 45 and 65 knots in a northerly fashion there, again for Saturday. For 3,000 foot winds, again with that vertically stacked low, southerly winds coming in Gulf of Alaska across the Panhandle, anywhere between 60 knots to 35 knots there in portions of the Panhandle. Otherwise northerly flow coming down through the Bering Sea and into the Alaska Peninsula with up to 55 knots there. And then with that another low out there in the western Aleutians, bringing some counterclockwise flow associated with that system, again at 3,000 feet. For turbulence on Saturday, went for considerable moderate, and you might see some areas of isolated severe out there with that low pressure in the Gulf of Alaska, and that could be showing up there in portions of the coastal areas for Saturday, but look for the surface to 4,000 feet in some of those areas, and that extends over into the Alaska Peninsula. But otherwise, surface of 3,000 feet in the Aleutians and portions of the Alaska Peninsula.